The scent of grass warmed beneath the afternoon sun wafts through the Slovakian farming village as the echo of the children laughing and the blissful collision of soccer balls against stone houses carries down a dusty winding road to a pair of tiny shoed feet and the toddler they belong to. Young Frey, a child barely 3 years old, her eyes the colour of melted chocolate and skin deep olive, totters swiftly across her quaint front garden towards her own soccer ball. She hesitates in her step, then swings out a foot, kicking the ball with the might of a small goddess. The ball rolls towards a beautiful woman with a cascade of brown curls and eyes as soft and dark as the child's own. Freya's mother, Larissa, stops the ball with her foot and clasps her hands in delight. "Good girl, Freya." Freya giggles. "Again, Mummy, again." Larissa indulgently nudges the ball back towards Freya. "Here it comes." Some ways down the road, a man's frame shadows the stone houses, passing by the group of children squabbling with their soccer balls. Beyond the sight of grown villagers preoccupied inside, preparing for their evening meals, or those still away from home not yet finished working the land for the day. The man's gait is swift, and he weaves between the dated buildings, making his way towards the village outskirts, careful to remain unseen. Behind the safety of an outlying stone hut, the man crouches down beside a large grey iron pipe, its surface slightly exposed from the rocky earth. Sweat drips from Lucien's scalp, running over the small scar on his left brow and into his green eyes. He swipes it away impatiently before swinging a satchel from his shoulder, eyes scanning his perimeter. Hastily, he unzips the bag. Plunging his hand inside, he produces a pen-sized metal device with a small hole on the back. With a soft press of his finger, Lucien activates the device and places it on the pipe. Mechanical legs spring out, latching onto the iron with a clang. A drill bit starts up, automatically boring through the thick shell of the pipe. The device is secured within seconds. Lucien retrieves a sleek, high-tech canister from his satchel, methodically locking it onto the back of the device. A contained hissing sound emits, and a small smile tugs at the corner of Lucien's mouth. For Lucien knows that he has single-handedly corrupted the water supply of this entire village. Knows that with every millisecond that passes, with every hiss of the device, microscopic nanobots shaped like clawed spaceships disperse and clutch onto the water particles that flow freely beneath the town into every building, every home. He knows that inside these water pipes, his nanobots are emitting little electric flashes, charging the water particles, causing the hydrogen atoms to split. In 30 seconds, the atoms will rise and expand into angry bubbles. Within minutes, Lucien's mission will be complete. The sun dips a little further, driving the golden afternoon towards evening. Freya giggles as she lines up another kick and drives the ball as hard as her little foot can handle towards Larissa. "Such a strong girl, Freya. Look at how clever you are. Are you thirsty?" Freya nods at her mother as a curiously shaped pebble captures the toddler's attention. She plonks herself on the ground to examine it closer. The neighbor's boy, Finn, just a little older than Freya, makes his way towards the girl, and Larissa smiles to see his sweet blonde head toddle into view. He seats himself beside Freya with familiarity, offering up his own pebble for her to see. Larissa laughs at the two young ones before ducking inside to the house, her gaze straight through the kitchen window and into the front garden, her eyes always on Freya. Larissa doesn't notice the subtle white haze of gas filling the room. Lucien is far from the village now. It casts in the distance as barely a shadow over his shoulder, in line with the setting sun. His breath comes out in hoarse gasps. He moves in haste, wanting to be over and done with his orders. Lucien strides another few steps and turns back towards the village, bestowing it a lingering glance. He dips his hand into the pocket of his pants, fishing out a small remote control, eyes again on the picturesque stone buildings, ears filled with the laughter of children. Lucien presses the button. Her gaze still on little Freya and Finn, playing cheerfully in the garden. Larissa reaches for the plastic pink cup drying next to the sink. She doesn't see the tiny flash of a spark or hear the strange hiss from the kitchen tap as it releases a stray droplet of water. Larissa lowers Freya's cup beneath the tap and twists on the water. Her eyes are still imbued with the reflection of Freya and Finn as the tap explodes beneath her hands and the house is engulfed with flame. Screams and shrieks of survivors are dwarfed by the loud, sporadic explosions of each building in the village. Nowhere has been left untouched. Nowhere is safe. Freya and Finn cry together in the wake of collapsed and charred rubble. The decimated village lies in ruins around the orphaned children. Freya frantically rubs at her cheeks, black dust mixing with the tears and dripping down her cherub cheeks. The ruins of the village smolder, and thick, black smoke billows up into the sky. A small mercy granted to the survivors of the attack, an opportunity to signal for help, a chance for others to receive their warning. A world exists beyond that mundane little life that you live in. A world where intelligence is worshipped and pilots are God. A world filled with biotechnology that can save lives or end them.
A war is brewing beneath the surface of everything you understand to be real. Ours is a tale of revenge, love, and desperate ambition. Will you come with us?
I see you standing there, straight in an arrogance what I wouldn't give to tear you down.
Welcome to episode 1 of Interface, the Creator's Champion. We're your hosts, Ellie Popov
and Charles Jazz Terrier. Low listener, what are we waiting for?
Tango waves around your neck will hang you out to dry. Tango waves around your neck will hang you out to dry.
The first of the sun's buttery rays peeked through the window from behind the edges of dark block-out curtains and spread their beams across the scattered clothing and rubbish that littered the bedroom's desk and floor. A young man, blonde, the pallid skin around his blue eyes bruised and slightly sunken from lack of sleep, sat at the desk amidst empty chip packets and a half-eaten bowl of cereal. The hours of the night had bled into morning without the man's awareness as he tapped away at a glowing keyboard. His eyes darting between the screens of his triple monitor setup, the force of the pale man's hands against the plastic maneuvering his fingers like a master pianist across the keys, crunched away into the silence of the dawn. Wyatt Hawkins raised a can of energy drink to his lips and sweaked at it deeply, inhaling the sweet liquid down his throat like an addict, knowing he was setting the tone for the day ahead. Wyatt was almost regretful of the caffeine crash he would undoubtedly suffer through later on. Almost. His central monitor screen rolled through a series of code and Wyatt swiped across his mousepad, shifting the window to the left monitor. Where the code once was, a website now monopolized the screen in a myriad of black, green, red, and white colors. The online uniform of the Department of Defense Personal Database. Wyatt watched eagerly as a prominent red countdown descended. 8 seconds, 7 seconds, 6. Come on, come on. As the timer hit 2 seconds, Wyatt twitched his hand, considering exiting the window. But he was so close. Closer than he'd ever been before. And Wyatt wanted to see it through. Every aspect of himself relied on this moment. The isolation, the distrust, the life he denied after she'd. A bing sounded loudly and the timer reset itself to 6 minutes. Its digits turning a less alarming green. Yes! Wyatt cried into the partial darkness of the room, almost disbelieving of his good luck. Wyatt had been searching for a way since his teens. Really, since the moment she'd left him. And his desperation for her truth had started to eat him alive from the inside out. The website opened up into a series of sub-windows. Defense member profiles in various states of deceased and non-active. Wyatt scrolled hungrily through each of them, searching for a glimpse of her. His eyes flitting back and forth to the countdown which continued to show as a comforting green. Terrified of missing her in his frantic search and losing the only window he had, Wyatt slowed his pace, sifting through each profile listing carefully. His hand turned clammy as he reached the H's. His fingers slid through the list and halted on the pad as he spotted Hawkins, Elizabeth. There she was, listed as just another nondescript name amongst thousands of others, deceased during duty. Wyatt's breath hitched a fraction as his fingers on his pad hovered over Lizzie's name, simultaneously scared and anxious to read her secrets. His tired, heavy eyes betrayed the caffeinated high surging through him, and Wyatt blinked in frustration as he clicked into the profile. A blaring, whooping alarm sounded suddenly through Wyatt's speakers. A painful gush of adrenaline spiked down his neck, and Wyatt noticed the countdown had returned to its angry red state, descending from less than a minute. Shit. Wyatt scrolled through Lizzie's profile quickly, trying to burn the details into his mind. Lizzie's profile photos, dates, tours of duty, locations, medals. The details about Lizzie's time with the Department of Defense were minimal, and besides the deceased label next to her name, there was no reference to her death, no implication that nodded toward a real explanation for her abandonment of himself and Wyatt's father. Nothing about why their lives had been destroyed with her loss. Wyatt's light blue eyes rose to meet the deep ocean of his mother's. The screen of the left-hand monitor flashed, drawing Wyatt's attention. The coding program disappeared and was replaced by the dark silhouette of a panda skull. Its giant, protruding fangs seeming to drip with black blood. Unable to control himself, Wyatt flinched against the back of his chair. What the? Wyatt struggled to keep his cool against the sense of foreboding that began to grow. He knew he'd been infiltrated. Someone knew he was here. He checked the clock again, realizing he had 17 seconds left until the website locked him out. 17 seconds to figure out what the fuck had really happened to his mother. No, no, no! Wyatt shouted at the monitor, slamming his forearms against the desk. Frantic, Wyatt tried to push his frustration aside and continued to search the personnel file. Scrolling through to the bottom, he found a link to something called Interface Protocol. Instinctive suspicion had Wyatt hesitating only half a second, knowing he didn't have the time to fuck around. Sure, there was nothing else in Lizzie's profile that was useful to him. Knowing the link could be worth the risk, then Wyatt plunged ahead, clicking the link. All three of his computer screens turned a royal blue, the digital shade of technological death. Fuck! His consciousness screamed at him from inside of his brain. Wyatt was starting to get a sense of just how screwed he was about to be. He needed to disengage before anyone tracked his IP address. Quickly, Wyatt launched himself from his chair and scrambled for the power cord that connected his system to the wall. Tipping his chair over in the process, he yanked the plug out hastily, hoping he'd been fast enough. Wyatt's bedroom plunged into darkness, with only the slight trickle of the dawn's light through the curtains peeping within, mocking him. Wyatt edged towards the curtains and tweaked at the end, just enough to peer out onto the street. He squinted from the morning sun, his eyes taking their time to adjust. Wyatt looked left and right, but the street was still, aside from a pair of joggers, which passed by his unit, a young couple dressed in matching workout wear like the kind you see wannabe Instagram influencers don for likes. He stared at them until they exited out of his line of sight. Did he pull the cords fast enough? Would they track him here? How the hell had his security protocols failed him that horrifically? Wyatt's heart thumped achingly inside his chest as he considered his options. He could run, but Wyatt had no significant savings, nowhere to go, no friends to ask for help, and most importantly, no real excuse to leave. After a moment, Wyatt decided that the best thing to do was probably just pretend like everything was normal. No altering of his routine or unexpected activities. Wyatt had known he'd run the risk of being caught if he hacked into a military database, but he had to try. For her. If the military did trace his IP, well, maybe, just maybe he could play dumb. Maybe they would think he was just some kid who played too many computer games and overindulged in Mr. Robot. Just some nerdy 20-something-year-old who was searching for his mommy, if they even bothered to pay him that much attention. Despite the fact that no undercover feds were knocking down his door, Wyatt spread through his morning routine, unable to shift the vision of the blood-dripping panda skull from his mind. The military's attention was one thing, but the foreign hacker was a different kind of threat. Someone else knew what Wyatt had done. The thought sent a cold shiver up his spine. He dressed hastily in black slacks and a white button-up shirt for work, throwing a hoodie on over the top for good measure, despite the expected Queensland heat, before rushing out to greet the 7:30 a.m. bus. An hour later, Wyatt stood outside of a rundown brick apartment complex holding a paper bag, the kind that always exists on the outskirts of a city. The rent still a little pricey despite the 50-year or so age of the building and a lack of modern utilities. His eyes swept the surrounding streets and equally run-down buildings, watching for anything out of the ordinary. Not even so much as a cat peeped out at him. Deciding there was a clear lack of threat existing in the street, Wyatt headed into the building. After climbing 3 flights of stairs, Wyatt stopped outside a yellowed, chipped wooden door and knocked. A second or so ticked by before the door swung open, revealing a solidly built man in his mid-40s in the doorway. The man's dirty blonde hair was speckled with gray, and he looked weathered as if he'd spent a lot of time in the sun. Large, calloused hands reached for Wyatt's paper bag before he spoke. "What's with the winter gear?" John asked skeptically before referring to Wyatt's hoodie. Wyatt dipped the hood from his head and shrugged in response. "I was cold." "Well, that's because there's not any meat on you." Wyatt pushed past his father, ignoring the not-so-subtle criticism. John, however, lingered by the front door, peering into the paper bag. For crying out loud! John stalked into the small dining room and sat himself opposite to Wyatt at the shabby wooden table. He tore at the paper bag in ill-contained frustration, lifting out a round, black plastic bowl with a clear lid and a plastic spoon. Pulling open the lid, he plunged the spoon into the chia seeds, yogurt, and fruit contained within, looking thoroughly unimpressed. "I wouldn't mind as much if you ate this shite with me," John grumbled, hinting at his desire for his son to share his sufferings. Wyatt lifted a brow, his father's reaction to the package not unexpected. "Yeah, well, when my cholesterol is through the roof, maybe I'll join you." "I eat fine, you know," John replied through tentative mouthfuls. "Sure, Big Mac a day does wonders for the coronary arteries," Wyatt scoffed. Wyatt's father at least had the decency to look sheepish at that. "It's got lettuce in it." Attempting to appease his son, John choked down a large spoonful of the bowl's contents, watching uncomfortably as Wyatt's gaze shifted to a silver-framed photograph placed neatly on top of a nearby cupboard. The delicacy of the frame looked out of place in the dated kitchen. The photograph showed a younger Wyatt, smiling happily between a less lined John with his arm around Lizzie, who, though in uniform, looked less severe than in her military profile image which Wyatt had sighted that morning. Lizzie's stance beside her family was casual, her golden hair tumbling loosely around her shoulders. Wyatt hated that uniform on her, hated that his father had this one out on display. John took another mouthful of his cheer slop. "Did Mom ever talk about work?" Wyatt asked, feigning nonchalance. John cleared his throat. "Not really, mate. I could never keep up with the science mumbo-jumbo. She was way too smart for me. Must be where you get it." Wyatt's gaze broke away from the photo and focused on his cup of coffee. John watched him out the side of his eye, concerned. "You haven't mentioned her in a while, mate. Do you want to..." Wyatt stifled a laugh. "Yeah, in the 5 minutes you've got before you're off again." Wyatt pushed out his chair abruptly as John blanched in ill-concealed pain. "Oh, come on, mate, that's not fair." Wyatt headed for the front door, barely throwing a glance over his shoulder to his father. Beside the front door, Wyatt noticed a pair of steel-capped boots, which had been neatly placed next to a plain, black travel bag. "I've got to get to work," Wyatt muttered vaguely in John's direction as he headed out the doorway. "We'll talk after I get back, yeah?" John's voice raised in frustration, his tone imploring more from Wyatt, but the door had already closed. Wyatt's journey from John's apartment into Fortitude Valley was quick and filled with covert glances and suspicion, mostly from Wyatt, who studied the people around him with distrust and dislike. In this part of town, and at this time of morning, Wyatt rubbed shoulders with the city's dregs, drug addicts and the homeless, or those that were still making their way home after an irresponsible Sunday night out party. In an interesting juxtaposition, Fortitude Valley also played host and workplace to some of Brisbane's most contemporary elite and entrepreneurial population. The mix of classes caused architectural chaos as Wyatt's eyes passed over the torn club posters and stained walls besides glittering glass high-rises with fancy offices. The street smelled like a combination of stale cigarette butts, spilled alcohol, and boutique cafes with freshly baked goods and expensive percolated coffee. Wyatt made his way down the busy city street, still wary of staying out in the open for too long. Not paying attention, his foot caught on a raised crack in the concrete, launching him off balance. His step faltered. Almost instantaneously, a young, corporately dressed woman with pale alabaster skin and chestnut hair bumped into him. "Watch it!" the woman hissed, pushing herself away from Wyatt before resuming her no-nonsense strut in the opposite direction. Though he knew she wouldn't hear him, Wyatt couldn't help but mutter, "Sorry," his face reddening as his gaze followed the woman down the street. He immediately wanted to tell himself to shut up. That snobbed-up woman didn't care that this morning he'd hacked into a military database, that he was scared out of his mind at the consequences he was waiting to drop at any moment, or that his father was abandoning him again. No. In a society where perfection was demanded and your next sexual partner or best friend was just an easy swipe away, no one thought about anyone but themselves and their needs. That woman didn't give a flying fuck that he was so anxious he'd almost cracked his face open. He didn't care that the last thing he needed was a verbal assault aimed at his clumsiness. The word sorry wouldn't have even made a dent in her self-observed, self-justified little world. Composing himself, Wyatt resumed his original path, this time picking up his pace. A few minutes later, Wyatt stopped before a beat-up brick building that had clearly seen better years. The building stood 4 stories high, but was not as trendy as its taller, artfully designed high-rise brothers and sisters. He eyed the dirty bricks of the building in disdain. Wyatt had never imagined that this was where he would end up. The things that Wyatt could do with technology and most others couldn't do in their wildest dreams. He'd always been on top of his class, evading the social expectations of the education system to instead stay home and study, to teach himself the intricacies of technology that superseded even his own wildest imagination. Wyatt had rarely met a system he couldn't hack, a firewall he couldn't break. Proof of that stood in this morning's endeavors. As a kid, Wyatt's sole focus had been to follow in his mother's footsteps, until she was gone. They told his father she died in the line of work, offering no substantial information or explanation, and John had believed them. No questions asked. Almost like he didn't want to know. Almost like maybe he was too scared to. Wyatt's life had spiraled since then. He'd refused a scholarship to Queensland's top university, the University of Queensland. He'd introverted further, obsessively searching for his mother's presence through the file systems of others, finding a severe lack of information until this morning when he'd finally hacked her military file. Through the days of grief and desperation, Wyatt had ended up here, his future gushing down the drain like a nasty case of diarrhea. He stared at the entrance of a building a moment more, disdain etched into his expression, before he dragged his unwilling feet through the entrance. Once inside, Wyatt climbed the staircase 2 at a time, resenting the lack of an elevator. Reaching the second floor, he paused before a glass window labeled Lion Insurance, before pushing through it roughly. The door opened into a minimally decorated waiting foyer for clients, edged by a simple white reception desk and a dividing wall. Wyatt's heart gave an uncomfortable thud as he caught sight of the golden-skinned beauty behind the desk. Crystal twirled her chocolate hair distractedly as she chatted on the reception phone, not even giving Wyatt so much as a glance as he bolstered into the room. Wyatt averted his gaze from her and continued past the wall divider. The space beyond spread out into an open-plan office with multiple desks situated around the room. At the room's head stood a Jurassic-looking communal scanner and water cooler. Closed doors placed at random locations around the office led the way to more exclusive offices of senior workers, a tiny boardroom that he was almost never invited into, a storage room, a small kitchenette, and the staff bathrooms. Unable to help himself, Wyatt scanned the open area, looking for anything, or anyone, out of the ordinary, but nothing flagged. He then made a beeline for his desk, flopping heavily into his chair and booted up his company-allocated computer. Whilst Wyatt waited, he flicked at the V for Vendetta bobblehead situated on the flat space before him. The singular personalized possession of his non-senior worker, non-exclusive desk. Wyatt watched as Lion Insurance spelled out slowly across the monitor screen. The scrawl of the font was fancy, a misattempt at marketing the insurance as an elite consumer option, rather than the bordering on the illegal scam it really was. In a small way, Wyatt was thankful that he wasn't part of the customer service or sales team that trapped people into the confines of the company's tricky legislation, something that was filled with terms and conditions that allowed for the daylight thievery of Lion's clients, but left its customers out on their asses when they needed to cash in their policy. Instead, Wyatt's job was to ensure the coding and security systems for Lion's insurance website and custom-created software, built and executed by Wyatt himself, ran smooth and secure, something that was no easy task in an office filled with technologically illiterate idiots who were unwilling or unbothered to learn from him. The Lion Insurance security program launched the coding window open, and Wyatt sighed, readied, and already wearied for the day ahead. Hours later, Wyatt still sat at his desk, slouched over, fingers dancing across the keyboard as he tapped away into a coding window at the bottom of the monitor directly beneath the back-end page of Lion Insurance's website. Wyatt paused his coding action to take a sip from his freshly made cup of instant coffee, scowling at the bitter taste and wondering why the hell none of Lion's execs gave a crap enough to make a real coffee machine installed into the communal kitchenette. Leaning back, Wyatt stretched, his eyes on the program as it ran through a fresh coding sequence that checked the firewalls on Lion's Insurance financial files. Wyatt sipped again at his coffee, his fifth for the day. The panic from this morning had begun to dull as his day had remained uneventful, flatlined even. And with no particularly challenging work task before him, Wyatt felt the odd combination of hollowed weariness and shaky dehydration, a consequence of pushing his body to the edge of its limits with nothing but caffeine to prop it up. It was times like this that Wyatt understood why some professionals chose to introduce Coke into their work routine. The sound of feminine laughter rang out over the office, causing Wyatt to raise his eyeline from the monitor. He noticed Crystal standing by the communal scanner with Greg, the head of Lion's sales team, whose stiff hair was stylishly slicked back and a loud, trendy checkered shirt hugged his rather small, but still unfortunately there biceps. Wyatt wondered if the annoyingly bright shirt was trying to make up for other shortcomings. Another round of laughter rang out and Wyatt couldn't look away as Greg touched Crystal's shoulder flirtatiously, pretending to steady her. Wyatt cringed in disgust and disbelief. Why did women gravitate towards men like Greg? He couldn't understand how their gut instincts seemed to direct them all towards the asshole. Not that Wyatt had much experience with women, or any, at all. Greg, sensing Wyatt's eyes on him, flicked his gaze in Wyatt's direction, and grinned as Wyatt's attention darted quickly back to his monitor screen. Wyatt's stomach sank. He watched from his peripheral vision as Greg removed himself from Crystal, stalked across the office and approached Wyatt's desk, grinning like a Cheshire cat. Greg leaned his tanned, Mediterranean body into Wyatt's space, a yellow folder clutched under one arm. "Enjoying the view, Wyatt?" Greg asked with ill-contained arrogance. Wyatt pretended to have just noticed Greg's arrival. What? No, I was just... Much to Wyatt's disappointment, Greg's grin grew even larger at Wyatt's blatant awkwardness. Relax, mate. I respect a man who's willing to watch and learn. Greg cut Wyatt off. The thing about women, Wyatt, is that they crave direction. Greg gave Wyatt a greasy wink. Every one of them is dying to be bent over a desk. You just gotta take the lead. Greg paused, waiting for his advice to elicit a reaction from Wyatt. When Wyatt remained silent, Greg couldn't help but push. He threw an exaggerated glance over his shoulder towards Crystal, who was now occupied filling her large 2-liter water bottle up from the filtered water cooler. Wyatt followed Greg's gaze. Greg turned back to him sharply, catching Wyatt before he could lower his eyes again, pleased to have caught him out. Take the lead, Wyatt. You understand what I'm saying? Wyatt nodded slowly, reluctantly, and Greg smirked and held out his fist for Wyatt to bump. Wyatt wanted to vomit, but he raised a matching fist anyway, struggling to keep his steady hand as Greg executed a number of overcomplicated hand gestures around Wyatt's hand. Eventually, the configuration ended on the classic knuckle bump, and Greg looked pleased with himself, as if he'd done Wyatt a serious favor. A master teaching a flailing student. Releasing Wyatt from his fist-bumping hell, Greg helped himself to a gulp of Wyatt's coffee. Nice blend. Now, Greg took another loud slurp from the mug. I give you insight, you do me a solid. Wyatt stayed silent, watching in horror as Greg dumped the yellow folder on the desk in front of him. Greg stared Wyatt down a moment as a silent tug-of-war battled out between the two men. But just like the other times, Wyatt only waited a moment to concede defeat. Wyatt nodded his acceptance slowly, and Greg barked out a laugh. Boss needs it by 4. Thanks, champ. Greg slapped Wyatt on the back before returning to Crystal to resume their flirtation, leaving Wyatt to consider just how much of a weak piece of shit he'd really become. Wyatt returned home around 6 that evening, clasping a bag of Chinese takeout as if it were the elixir of immortality. Dropping into his computer chair, he lifted the box of Chinese noodles from the takeout bag, quickly removing the lid and shoveling a plastic fork full of noodles into his mouth. He chewed slowly and paused to swallow before pressing a fingertip into the ignition button of his computer. If the system refused to turn back on after this morning's escapades, Wyatt wanted to have consumed at least one mouthful of body fuel before his appetite abandoned him again. To Wyatt's partial surprise, all 3 monitors switched on simultaneously, depicting his counter-surveillance program running in the forefront. Wyatt watched on as the program listed threats in one column, then switched them to the second column, labeling them neutralized. As each threat sequence was transported into the second column, Wyatt's internal terror switched to disconcert. Everything was looking normal, and if his security software could just keep that foreign infiltrator out, he could move past this morning's events with no lasting consequences. Maybe come up with a new game plan for Lizzie. Wyatt shoved another forkful of noodles into his mouth and began his first task for the night with enthusiasm, hacking into Greg's dating profile. Wyatt chewed on the noodles and swallowed in a gulp as he launched the Find My Soulmate website and hacked into the coding backbone of the site. After a few taps, he was in. Greg's profile unraveled before his eyes, showcasing a cringeworthy dating bio and a myriad of profile pictures, most of them of Greg either topless, attempting to show off a somewhat unspectacular torso, or Greg with his arm around various beautiful women. Wyatt scoffed, navigating through the profile assets hungrily and flicking the images over to the left screen. The life Greg tried to paint for himself online was that he was a playboy high flyer. The pictures of Greg wrapped around beautiful women was Greg's way of showcasing his desirability. The lack of clothing was his absolute confidence and belief in himself that he was the shit. And they, being the women on the dating profile, should come get it. Wyatt just thought he looked like a greasy Greek boy still dressed by his mama. Suddenly, a particular photo of Greg with particularly chiseled abs caught Wyatt's eyes. He leant in, closer to his screen, and ran a photo forensics program to scan the subsequent photos. As Wyatt focused on the image results, already imagining the satisfying consequences of exposing Greg's doctored photos to Crystal, he failed to notice that the counter-surveillance program still running behind the scenes flagged an issue, leaving a threat on pending rather than neutralized. Red borders started highlighting Greg's photos and Wyatt grinned. "Photoshop?" questioned Wyatt delightedly. "Greg, you've got some hidden talents." The photo forensics program continued past Greg's own uploaded imagery and began its hunt through Greg's profile inbox, exposing some recent images sent to him from Crystal, mostly scantily clad and wearing a seductive smile. Upon sighting her smooth, bare skin and lacy lingerie, a ball of resentment began to build in the pit of Wyatt's stomach. The office flirtation had clearly progressed further than he'd guessed. "Huh," he breathed. As the program continued to shuffle through, not a single one of Crystal's photos flagged as doctored. Wyatt couldn't tell if he was more disappointed that Crystal was really that attractive, or that deep down he knew he hadn't expected anything less. For multiple private pictures meant for Greg's eyes only, Crystal smiled out at Wyatt, and her caramel curves glistened from strategically posed limbs. As he stared at her, he felt his nether region twitch, and he shifted in his seat, subduing his shame. "Run towards the asshole, Crystal." A slow smirk carved its way into Wyatt's expression as he contemplated his next move. Opening up a paint program, Wyatt began his work by importing the photos of Greg with his beautiful acquaintances and drew a lopsided, square-shaped smiley face, superimposing it onto the heads of the women and exporting them back onto the site. Wyatt then doctored Greg's display picture to show Greg flaunting a pair of skinny legs in a tutu. Overly pleased with his work, Wyatt failed to notice as the pending listing on his surveillance website changed to warning. The photograph manipulation wasn't enough for Wyatt, and he continued to dig through the rest of Greg's profile. Laughter cackling out of his mouth as he began to rewrite Greg's bio, cutting through Wyatt's sounds of glee. The security alarm revved up, unleashing its deafening siren, a repeat of that morning's chaos. His attention snapped to the counter-surveillance program, still nestled into the corner of the far right of his screen. Fear washed over him like a cold wave as he read the flashing system compromise warning in the column. "Holy shit," he whispered in disbelief. Again, someone had managed to get through his barrage of cybersecurity, only this time he wasn't as vulnerable. This time, he hadn't hedged the system to the coding stems of a high-profile mainframe. This time, his security system was fully functioning and about as bricked up as he could get. His thoughts racing, Wyatt immediately flashed back to this morning when he was infiltrating Lizzie's file, to the panda skull dripping with black blood. Instinctively, Wyatt knew it was the same hacker. With no time to lose, Wyatt sprang into action, his fingers hammering at the keyboard. Trying to lock the perpetrator out, he pulled up an emergency protocol which showed 7 separated firewall breaches. All 7 torn down. Dumbfounded, Wyatt watched on as the 8th fell within seconds. How the hell? His hesitation momentary, his fingers gliding and punching across the keys. Wyatt launched another program and watched in horror as it showed red code smashing through his white code, corrupting it into meaningless symbols. Wyatt's heart hammered as he pivoted his action, instead turning his attention to constructing a containment program on the fly. Wrestling with the human slowness of his speed, the red code streaked past every white wall Wyatt attempted to erect, and he had the profound and fearful realization that he was dealing with a master hacker, someone who housed a skill level he'd never encountered before. But Wyatt, a master in his own right, charged ahead. He slammed a final wall into place and swiped right, throwing the now contained hack into the right screen and into a tracking program. The immediate danger averted, Wyatt congratulated himself with a steadying breath. His eyes stared down the tracking program into a silent plea. "Now, show me who you are." As if the hacker could hear him, an icon representing a VPN appeared at the bottom right of his screen, snaking a line upwards. Then a second icon appeared beside it, transforming into a coding box. Wyatt attacked the code with ferocity, desperate to push the unknown foe out of his system. And just when the foreign code began to neutralize, a third icon appeared beside it. The sequence repeated itself, 2 lines snaking out, and this time in another direction. "Oh, you're good," Wyatt laughed, breathless and a little hysterical. "But don't think I'll fall for that false trail bullshit." Now the icons continued to appear faster and in numerous locations. Wyatt leapfrogged them, shutting them down with a godlike speed. The icons built up on top of each other like Tetris, until Wyatt found his attention drawn to the top of the main screen, which was now mostly covered in complex chemical-looking formulas. The last of the icon boxes proved harder to neutralize than the rest, and Wyatt struggled to pull his attention away from the formulas to focus on the code. As he finally got a good look at it, He noticed this one had a name. Circuit games, Wyatt said out loud. Frowning to himself, he'd heard of it before, but only in whispers through esports and gaming forums. Whispers that were always quickly shut down and deleted. That's an urban legend. Suddenly, all three of Wyatt's screens flashed a blood red. A subliminal silhouette of a panda skull dripping with black blood thrust itself into each of the screens and was the last thing Wyatt saw before the hacker forced his system to power down. Wyatt pushed back from his desk slightly and stared at the black screens, still trying to comprehend what had just happened. He pushed his chair further back from the keyboard, confused, horrified, and drained. A subtle darkness had seeped into the room, the artificial glow of the monitors now absent. Wyatt leaned back and stretched, trying to work the adrenaline out of his shoulder blades and trying to calm the hammering in his chest, trying not to freak the fuck out. Who would have gone to this much trouble to hack him? Who was it that had found him this morning? Was someone coming for him? What the hell was he supposed to do now? Think, Wyatt. Think. Wyatt took a shaky breath and closed his eyes, opening them to the vision of a tall, dark-skinned man with bulging biceps wearing a mask that matched the bleeding skull silhouette from his screens. The man leaned over the top of him, sharing Wyatt's breath. His long, black dreadlocks falling into Wyatt's face and across his shoulders. Wyatt didn't even have time to scream. Wyatt became aware of the deep orange glow first, vibrant and bleeding into his bleary eyes, piercing and bright. Like Helios charging with wild steeds into the sky, pushing the darkness from his domain. Next it was his heart, deep and thudding, but fast. It hurt in his chest, and as he came to, it only sped up in pace. He yanked at his hands and feet, knowing it was useless. The cable bindings constrained him to the chair so tightly they were cutting into his circulation. Wyatt wouldn't have been surprised if they had drawn blood. Despite it all, Wyatt rattled around just to see if he could force his freedom out of sheer will alone. He allowed himself a few moments of his flailing before he tried to ground himself, an attempt to regain some kind of control over his predicament. He could feel that he'd been stripped to his underwear as the lightest of air movement tickled the most sensitive areas on his naked chest and thighs. Wyatt was exposed, and worse, trapped, imprisoned. Next, Wyatt noticed the pressure that wrapped around his skull, circular, like a headband from hell. The pressure held itself over his eyes and pressed down harshly over the bridge of his nose. He was masked inside some kind of contraption, and that's where that insane orange light was coming from. Breathe, Wyatt, and then breathe again. Following his orders, Wyatt took a short breath in, focusing on the oxygen traveling down his throat and filling his lungs. He held it there for a moment before letting the air exhale even slower, trying to double his inhale time, something he'd heard actors did to calm their nerves. His mind slowed the smallest amount, and Wyatt remembered the rough feel of a dark man's dreadlocks draped across his skin. A lightning memory flashed before his eyes, recalling the panda skull mask wrapped around the man's head, the claustrophobia of the man bearing down on him. Before he could fully unleash his breath, a strange, almost metallic sound began to ring in his ears. It sounded digital somehow, like it was being filtered through a bass-heavy vocoder. From within the mask, the orange light transformed into a spectrogram which matched the digital sound, morphing, twisting and shifting colors to suit the pace of the rhythm. It took a few seconds for Wyatt to realize the display was replicating the pace of his own breathing. This caused Wyatt to take a sharp breath, which resulted in a spiked, sporadic rise in the spectrogram's effects. Wyatt felt disorientation wash over him like nausea. "Who do you work for, Wyatt?" A feminine retro text-to-speech voice spoke loudly through the mask system, causing the spectrogram to again spiral madly. Wyatt turned his head this way and that, as if he could somehow glimpse where the voice was coming from through the system. Instead, he found himself transported into a light show as the spectrogram morphed itself into a copy of the Aurora Borealis. The voice spoke again, digitally booming in through his eardrums. "What were you looking for?" Wyatt remained tight-lipped, trying to think through the parade of colors and the insistence of the digital breath sounding in his ears. His eyes found focus, and he rallied himself, pushing and pulling against his bonds. Wyatt couldn't help it. He was naked, terrified and bound. He had no idea where the fuck he was, and he realized that the introduction of the feminine voice meant that there was more than one. Not just the masked black man, but a woman also. He was outnumbered. Wyatt began screaming, pumping the adrenaline through his blood, hoping for an influx of that super strength that you read about. The kind where heroes that lift cars off little kids. He screamed and yanked, ripping at his bonds, the pain in his wrists and ankles almost unbearable as the ties cut through his skin. But Wyatt could not free himself. The realization caused him to still and slump forward. The voice seemed to wait for him to accept defeat before striking up again. Who do you work for, Wyatt? Wyatt gripped the arms of the chair until his knuckles turned white, trying to slow his breathing down. Think, Wyatt. Think. A blinding white light erupted from the screen of the mask, along with the screeching sound of digital distortion. Instinctively, Wyatt tried to cover his ears, his wrists caught painfully by the bonds. Seconds later, the second cut back to the rhythmic digital breathing and the fluid spectrogram returned. Don't think. Answer. Who do you work for? The voice boomed into his ears. Wyatt tried to straighten his fingers, stiff from their fearful grip. I don't, he finally responded. Who does Mr. Cyborg work for? Wyatt shifted in his chair, unable to conceal the recognition of the name. He'd known in his gut the moment he came to that the hacker, or hackers, had taken him. He wondered how much information they managed to pull out of his system before he'd shut them out. Wondered how he could get out of this alive. Through the digital torture, Wyatt tried to think. His mind recalled a defense segment he'd come across accidentally on YouTube a few months back, when he was binging on the free crime documentaries. The host had been a burly, hairy man with broad shoulders and a strong jaw. The kind of man who looked like he knew how to hold his own in a fight. Wyatt remembered the man had said the most important thing you could do to aid your chance of survival was to keep your abductor talking. So Wyatt spluttered out an unconvincing laugh, feigning nonchalance. Yeah, okay, Mr. Cyborg, well, sounds like a dumbass superhero. The spectrogram dissolved before him, replaced with screen grabs of Wyatt ferreting around in the Department of Defense personnel files and then onto the pre-abduction virtual wrestle between Wyatt and the hacker with the snaking icons. Internally, Wyatt was shaken. His next tactic was straight denial. After all, there was no footage of him physically at the computer orchestrating anything the hackers had shown. That's some pretty trippy stuff. Looks like the kind of thing my cousin's into. I mean, he borrows my computer sometimes. The white light and digital distortion returned with a vengeance, louder and more abrasive this time. Wyatt slammed his eyes shut and held his breath, trying to hang on through the torture. When it failed to release him, Wyatt broke into a scream. The hackers suppressed their power play at the sound of Wyatt's pain, satisfied with its effect. The spectrogram began to glitch, showing gaps through the swirling imagery, coaxing him to open his eyes. Wyatt managed to catch glimpses of the room he was being held in. He was in darkness. The only light seemed to come from the moon, its eerie beams drizzling through the high bank of windows. The walls around him looked grimy and bare. And for the first time, he noticed the smell. A weird sort of dusty odor combined with the chemical smell of a hospital. You're running out of time, Wyatt. From the opposite side of a room, a door opened. A rectangle of white that peeped through the shifting translucence of the spectrogram before being obscured again. This time, a male voice broke through the digital haze. Who do you work for? The voice had the same retro taint as the woman's. Was this the dreadlocked man? Or was there three of them? The spectrogram led through another peak, the doorway filled with the sizable silhouette of a tall, muscular man wearing a skull panda mask. The same one Wyatt had glimpsed before his kidnapping. The glitch ended and colors filled the screen, blocking Wyatt's view again. Another splurge of fear washed through Wyatt's veins. Who's that? Who's that? What are you gonna do? He shook his head, desperate for another glimpse of the man, wondering how close he was to Wyatt now. Who is Mr. Cyborg? Who is your contact at Lion? The female voice had returned. Another glitch. A few seconds this time. Where Wyatt had previously had view of the room's exit, his sight was now filled with the menacing advance of the masked man. Closer as he was now, Wyatt could see the ebony dreadlocks and dark skin of the one who had taken him from his bedroom. Wyatt watched in horror as a glint of light reflected from the silver edge of a long blade in the man's right hand. Each step brought the man closer and closer. He raised the knife. The spectrogram blocked Wyatt's vision, consuming him instead with a three-dimensional rendering of Dante's Inferno. Demonic laughter inundated Wyatt's hearing, blasting horrifically through his ears. Absolute terror swept through Wyatt, and he knew he needed to loosen himself now and escape, or he would die. He snapped into action, rocking the chair back and forth and yanking desperately at its restraints. I didn't do anything, Wyatt shouted. I'm not a threat! A cold, sharp edge snaked up his throat and kissed the skin beneath his chin. Wyatt slowed his movements. his breath catching in his throat. Shards of memory splintered through his mind, showing him images of Lizzie and of John. What the hell was his father going to do without Wyatt's sporadic supervision? They'd probably die of cholesterol-crammed arteries? The blade pushed harder, and Wyatt felt the sting of it splitting through the first layer of his skin. As the pressure continued, Wyatt recoiled against the back of his chair until there was nowhere else left to go. Even in his absolute panic, Wyatt knew he was dead anyway. He had nothing left to lose. Finally, he gave in. "I'm Mr. Cyborg!" Wyatt cried out, breaking into hysteria. But I'm not working for anyone. I was looking for my mother." Despite his outburst, the pressure against his throat didn't relent, and Wyatt could only let out another scream as the fires of hell brightened into a painfully blinding white and the demonic laughter in his ears increased to a deafening level. Then everything flashed and turned dark. When Wyatt came to again, he was awoken by the light of the mask, this time softer and not so piercing against his eyes. He groaned despite the diffusion, his mind pounding with the painful thickness of a migraine as he wiggled in his chair. Wyatt was surprised to find that his hands were unbound, though his tiny flicker of hope soon died when he realized the restraints now strapped his chest to the torso of the chair. Before him, through the filter of the mask, Wyatt could see a portable desk where a plain black laptop sat open, waiting. Clearly, this wasn't even close to over. Wyatt raised a trembling hand sluggishly, and it bumped against the table. Again, he fell into the arms of darkness. This time when Wyatt woke, he managed to force the blanket of lethargy from him quicker. His migraine had reduced to a dull throb, and the light of the mask was even further diffused, dancing in swirls before his eyes in soft sunrise hues of a buttery yellow, orange, and blue. He twitched his hands, relieved to find they were still unbound. Wyatt was still groggy, but he remembered the sting of the blade against his neck, and he stretched against his skin, hissing at the painful confirmation that this wasn't all part of some weird nightmare. They had really taken him, and he still didn't know who the fuck they were. A message formed across the swirling screen of the mask. "Leave the goggles on." "Like hell!" Wyatt exclaimed in disbelief. He raised his hands to his face, but the mask flared dangerously, distorting his vision with the familiar blinding white light, warning him anyway. Wyatt dropped his hands and easily won defeat. He'd learned his lesson already. He knew what came next if he continued. He knew he had to play their game a little longer to stay alive. More words appeared on the screen of the mask. "Be a good boy." Wyatt gave a small nod and the bright light faded back to its dancing sunrise. There was silence for a few moments and no message was sent to him inside of the mask. But Wyatt could feel the tension, the expectation. They were waiting for him to make a move, to show them whatever it was they were really looking for. Though Wyatt couldn't see beyond the swirling hues, he dropped his hands and found the desk, still left close to him. He navigated his way to the laptop situated upon it by feel. Wyatt's hands were gentle across the surface of the keyboard, powered up and warm beneath his hands. As they tickled the pad, a mouse cursor appeared on the screen of his mask. He dragged the cursor over to the message that remained on the screen and clicked it, but nothing reacted. Wyatt sighed and instead tested the bonds around his chest. They held tight, and he knew there was no budging them. In the center of the mask screen, an image emerged from the diffused light, replacing the message. Wyatt flinched in recognition. A younger Wyatt stood out from the photograph from between his younger, happier parents. Lizzie in her military uniform, a tumble of golden hair about her shoulders, the photo from his father's house. Wyatt was simultaneously sickened and afraid. "What have you done to my dad?" he demanded. The answering voices were devoid of their previous retro text-to-speech tones, but instead bounced around his head with variable reverb and delay. A step closer to authenticity, but the disorienting effect on Wyatt remained. He tried to shake off the dizziness that threatened to overwhelm his already exhausted mind. "That's not the right question, Wyatt." The female voice answered first. Her UK accent was firm, but sleekly lilting, and Wyatt contemplated the possibility that he was no longer in Australia. "Your dad's about to have his beefy fingers caught in his boss's cookie jar," the male voice stated with amused arrogance. The voice had the tone of an American accent, but somehow Wyatt couldn't place it with the masked man from earlier. Wyatt was more confused than ever. The voices sounded genuine despite the reverb. Perhaps there really were 3 of them. Perhaps more. The reference to his father caused Wyatt's skin to prickle with a protective anger he hadn't realized existed for John. The echoing voices faded off, and inside the mask, 3 separate sets of graphics formed, one above the other. The first showed his father next to a bank account with $17,153 in it. Beneath that was a corporate holdings account of Coalfields Mining Limited, the company that his father contracted for, showing a value of $238,257,422. Wyatt watched aghast as the cursor reappeared, this time directed externally, cutting and pasting the 2 figures, swapping them around. The screen flashed as the system took a snapshot of the crime, and then a sound like an incoming email pinged in Wyatt's ears. The screen pulled up the inbox of the Australian Federal Task Force, and the insides of Wyatt's stomach roiled as he cited the most recent email headed with the subject line, John Hawkins, fraud. Wyatt flicked out his fingers across the pad of the laptop, but the cursor was unresponsive to his touch. "We'll give you a choice, Wyatt," the female voice drawled out seductively. On the left of Wyatt's screen, Lizzie's file popped up, the one Wyatt had hacked into the Department of Defense. "You can have a minute to hack into your mother's file," she continued, "or you can use that minute to wipe any trace of your father's crime from the server of the federal police." A 60-second counter appeared above the family photo that still remained on the now crowded screen. The countdown began, and Wyatt reached for the laptop again. This time it sprang into action beneath his touch. Wyatt turned his head to the left, towards Lizzie's file. The man's voice spoke up. "Told you he was a mommy's boy," he said, a smirk in his tone. But Wyatt wasn't directly accessing the personnel file. He opened a coding box and punched out reams of code in seconds. He glanced at the counter, sweat trickling down his brow. He fought the urge to hold his breath. 47, 46, 45, come on, Wyatt muttered under his breath. With 40 seconds remaining, Wyatt finished his first activity and slammed the enter key. Other windows opened sporadically across the screen, automated information from harvesters that commenced highlighting entries on his mother's file and copying the files they linked to. Despite the intensity of the situation, Wyatt couldn't help the spark of confidence that bubbled up inside him, the rush of rising to the challenge. Hacking, bending technology and information to his will, this is what Wyatt was made for. "Thanks for wedging open their firewalls. I couldn't do this at home." He let the remark slip from his lips before returning his attention to the counter. 36 seconds. His eyes swept past the figure and onto the Australian Federal Police email accounts that had been opened and displayed, each one with the subject line incriminating John sitting right at the top of the inbox. Wyatt ignored the individual accounts and instead focused on attacking the email hosting server itself. With 13 seconds to go, Wyatt received a prompt that asked, "Erase all?" Allowing himself a little smile, he clicked, "Yes, I'm sure." Every email in each of the individual accounts disappeared. 10, 9. Wyatt removed the open email windows from his screen and switched to the Coalfields Mining Limited corporate holding account. 8, 7, 6. He restored the financial figures back to the original accounts, this time with a slight alteration. His father's account now showed $117,153. 2 seconds. Wyatt spun his head back to the left. The harvesting program he had left running had grabbed nearly everything and sped towards the bottom of Lizzie's file. A highlight of interface protocol opened into a new window. Wyatt's eyes rose to focus on it eerily. That moment, a shrill, piercing sound screamed through his ears. The counter had hit 0. His time was up. Without any hesitation, the digital connection to Wyatt was cut, and the screen in his mask turned black. "But that wasn't part of the deal!" his mind yelled at him. "Fight for it, Wyatt. Now's not the time to be a little bitch." Out loud, Wyatt protested to whoever was still there to listen. Hey, I haven't read any of that yet!" Only silence met Wyatt's demands. "Fight, Wyatt," he tried again. "Come on! I've played your game. Now tell me what you want with me." Letters began to appear on the screen one at a time, tantalizingly drawing the message out. "Good night, Wyatt." Hastily, Wyatt switched tactics and began to beg instead. No, please, no. The silence remained, a message telling him they were done. It was over for now, and if they were done with him, they would turn him off again. Wyatt's hands flew to his mask in a rush, but he was too late. The familiar glow flared up around his face, and then darkness settled in. Wyatt awoke laying on his side on a white-sheeted cot. His cheek stuck to the clean-smelling linen beneath his face. His eyes focused in the subdued daylight, and Wyatt let out a small breath of relief as it clicked that he was no longer strapped to a chair. He could tell he'd been moved to a new room. Maybe that meant the torture was over. For now. This room was larger than the other, with bare walls that possibly hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades. and barred, translucent windows. His surroundings looked like something that belonged in a third-world hospital. The wound on his neck stung, and instinctively Wyatt reached for it, discovering that his throat had been dressed with a surgical bandage. Wyatt couldn't tell exactly what that meant. If his kidnappers were planning on killing him, why would they administer medical attention? Unless he was more valuable to them alive. Unless he had passed whatever kind of test he'd just endured in the room of digital nightmares. Something shifted in the room, and Wyatt turned his attention toward the movement. Near his bedside, a man of slight stature was bent over his side table, placing a tray of cereal, toast, and what looked like orange juice down onto its worn surface. He straightened up, and Wyatt watched wordlessly as the man's elegant Asian features crinkled into a warm smile. Wyatt guessed the man to have been in his early 40s, with the mildest of gray peppering peeping out from behind his ruffled black hair. His clothing was most strange. The man was dressed in a pair of navy coveralls, customized with multiple pockets and gadgets. Around his hips sat a tool belt laden with small tools. Some he recognized and some he didn't. And above the man's brow, a pair of steel spectacles with a small torchlight and multiple-sized magnifying glasses clung to his forehead. "Excuse me," the man said. "Good morning. My name is Fergus." The man's accent had the same lilting foreign quality as the woman he remembered from the torture room, leaving him again to wonder where the hell he actually was. Quickly, Wyatt sat up in response, and as the white sheet fell from his bare skin, he became very much aware he was still only dressed in his underwear. In a panic, he turned about the room looking for an exit. Yet by the doorway stood another man dressed in basic black military-like fatigues with rippling muscles and flawless black skin. The man's dreadlocks reached far down his back. He stared at Wyatt unblinkingly with the piercing gaze of a killer. Undoubtedly the man in the panda mask. The man who had cut his throat. Wyatt leaped backwards out of the bed and crashed into the side table. The breakfast tray hit the floor hard, the glass and ceramics clattering loudly as they shattered on the concrete floor. Wyatt half-crouched behind the table, the furthest point that he could get from the dreadlocked soldier. Fergus regarded the mess on the floor, looking anxious. "Oh dear. Keep the hell away from me!" Wyatt attempted to yell. Instead, his voice came out awkward and husky, like an animal yelping its insubstantial protest against an overpowering predator. "Your reaction is really not necessary. I assure you that Isaiah won't harm you." Fergus attempted to soothe him. "Tell that to my throat," Wyatt retorted. The door behind Isaiah opened and he moved aside. His eyes remained on Wyatt, his hunter's gaze locked on Wyatt's crouching form. Through the doorway stalked a woman who looked just a little older than Wyatt. Her hair was long and black, tousled except for the complicated braids on one side of her head. Her eyes, perhaps the most striking of all features, were rimmed in coal and a vivid gray. Slanted from some sort of exotic ancestry, a half-smile flirted across full, pink lips. Like her two predecessors, the woman was dressed a little oddly. Her knee-high metallic silver boots had a futuristic edge to them and rose up to meet tight black pants and a haphazard yet stylishly ripped jumper that had fallen from one shoulder. "Good morning. I apologize for the theatrics. Necessary protocols, I'm afraid." The woman's voice was smooth and firm with a UK lilt. The same voice from Wyatt's torture chamber. Wyatt grimaced and gathered himself, staring at her. She was behind this? "Protocols? From the psychopath's handbook? What the hell do you want, lady?" Wyatt couldn't keep the venom from his voice, yet despite being focused on the situation at hand, he was somewhat proud of himself to keep his shit together in the presence of such a woman. Wyatt hadn't even been able to speak to Crystal, much as yell at her. And Wyatt knew that if he'd met this beautiful stranger on the street or in a bar, he'd have rather ripped out his own eyes than to have faced the humiliation of attempting a conversation with her. "My name is Frey," she spoke again. "I'd like to offer you a job." Wyatt was taken aback with disbelief. Of all the things he'd internally prepared himself for, not that he'd had much time to consider much between this woman's bouts of torture, that was not what he had been expecting. He couldn't believe that the kidnapping, the throat-cutting, the threat to his father was all part of some kind of over-the-top interview. Wyatt was beyond pissed. He found himself filled further with a confidence he didn't realize he possessed, and he aimed it all at the woman before him. "Pretty extreme interview process, don't you think?" A flicker in her brow at his tone, but she looked unfazed. "It's a pretty extreme job." Wyatt stood from his crouch, the animalistic fear beginning to retreat from his body as his anger replaced it. He rolled his shoulders before he replied, "What kind of job?" Frey's smile widened, giving the impression of a lioness toying with her prey. "I want you to win a game for me." Wyatt processed her words. A game? He remembered the morning he'd hacked into his mother's profile, however long ago that now was, and then it hit him like a ton of bricks. Though he couldn't be sure until... The circuit games? Fergus drew a breath from beside Wyatt. "You know about the games?" "Kind of. I thought it was a gamer's myth, until I saw it on one of your VPNs." Fergus and Frey exchanged a look, and Wyatt could feel the turn of tension in the air. He ventured further. "You really think kidnapping me and putting a knife to my throat is the best pitch for a job offer?" Frey rose to the challenge of Wyatt's snide remark. "You really think poking around covert military service wasn't going to get you flagged on someone's radar?" She watched with satisfaction as Wyatt visibly blanched. "Don't worry," she continued. "I know you're not a terrorist. You were just looking for some information on your mother. You're just lucky it was my radar you flagged on." Frey paused and dipped her head slightly, a sly look creeping onto her face. "I won a bet because of your efforts last night." Wyatt stared at her, struggling to decipher the woman in front of him. "How do you—" Frey cut him off, losing patience. "I know you must have a million questions. I'm not in a position to answer them." "Why?" Wyatt thought after her bullshit. It was the least she could actually do. "Because you ask too many questions. It's annoying," she retorted. Wyatt stepped off from the wall he was backed up against, inching towards Frey. "Then answer this, Blade Runner wannabe." Fergus barked out a laugh, shattering the intimidating atmosphere Frey was trying to instill in the room. Frey shot Fergus a look and his laughter turned into a cough, dropping his gaze. Wyatt was feeling more confident by the second. Feeling the immediate danger avert, he probed. "What exactly are you pitching me here?" Frey shifted her weight, maybe wondering how much to tell him. "Win all 3 rounds of the circuit games, and you'll take home more money than you'll ever earn at Lion Insurance." "And if I decline your offer?" Wyatt inclined his head, testing her. "What, you're gonna kill me, right?" Frey raised an eyebrow. "If you're dumb enough to say no, I'll take you home myself." Wyatt smarted at Frey's insult, unable to believe her audacity. The danger to himself now almost entirely forgotten, her little Blade Runner wannabe super squad had kidnapped and tortured him. They'd blackmailed him with the threatened incrimination of his father and forced him to perform like a circus monkey, practically naked, for a job interview, for a game. "Dumb?" Wyatt threw back at her. "You kidnapped me, drugged me, tried to frame my father as a criminal, and held a knife to my throat. What could possibly make you think I'd say yes?" Frey barely skipped a beat at his outburst, her voice even smoother as she changed tactics. "How's life going, Wyatt?" "Excuse me?" he spluttered. She gave him a knowing look. "You're incredibly intelligent. It's being wasted in this mundane little life you constructed for yourself." Frey stepped towards him with the grace of a panther, invading his personal space, boring down into his eyes. "You hide behind a computer, wasting your abilities that could rival that of the top cyber analysts of most government organizations, that you use instead to spy on pretty girls and take jabs at office bullies." Wyatt, locked onto Frey's piercing gaze, attempted to stare Frey down with little success. She slinked even closer towards him. "Wow," Wyatt said sarcastically. "The top cyber analysts? Oh, thanks for the compliment." Wyatt could feel Frey's body heat irradiating onto his bare chest. Now, more than ever before, he was aware of his lack of clothing. He was merely inches away from him. If he breathed too heavy, she'd feel it. Frey cocked her head, watching him, and Wyatt caught the sweet scent of her hair as it shifted. "It's not a compliment when the recipient is a waste of my breath," Frey replied superiorly. "Your sad little world undervalues intelligence, and I live in a world where it's worshipped, where tech is God and you can actually make a difference." She leaned even further into Wyatt's space and reveled as he instinctively moved back and had to stop himself. She continued, "So maybe you should consider coming to play on this side of the fence for a while. Or would you rather the sum total of your life be playing Mr. Cyborg and looking for mommy?" By now, Frey was so close to Wyatt that her lips almost brushed his. Though his insides shook, he fought against her intimidation, reluctant to let her see any further weakness. "That's a lot of words for wasted breath," he sneered into Frey's face. Without warning, Isaiah moved to open the door, causing a mild break in the tension between Frey and Wyatt. Another man entered the room, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark brown hair and a body built for combat. He donned what looked like plain black military trousers and combat boots with a black t-shirt that clung to his athletic frame. Some kind of tattoo peeked out from beneath a low-slung collar. A holster on his belt was empty, and Wyatt inwardly thanked whatever god existed. The man swaggered into the room with brazen arrogance and raised his eyebrows at Wyatt and Frey, still locked in their battle of wills. He smirked. "Put the boy down, Frey."
You have been listening to episode 1 of Interface, The Creator's Champion. This series is a Red Empire production and a Sound Vision Gold Coast original production, and has been written by Amy Casey, Ellie Popov, and Simon Kennedy.
This series is produced by Amy Casey and Roberto Mellini. Executive produced by myself, Charles Jazz Terrier, Ellie Popov, Steve Chickerell, Wade Boys, and Sherry Hamrick Rowell. It is co-produced by Alex Contis and Tom Cramsie. Editing, sound design, and music is done by Roberto Mellini and Tom Cramsie. Our production partners are the scandalous, but always effervescent Organic Media Group, and that theme song you keep hearing belongs to my co-host, Ellie Popov.
As you return to your mundane little lives, listeners, my advice to you all is to keep track of our next episode drop. Future information about the series can be found at www.redempireproductions.com. And don't forget to follow and subscribe to us via whatever streaming platform you're listening to us on. Join us again. Live beyond your understanding.
Mark my words, I'll find